The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm honored to be partnering for the first time with the Economic Club of Minnesota. Thank you, Mark, for the invitation. Thank you, Christine, for putting all this together as well. I have witnessed the great visibility of the Economic Club of Minnesota that has achieved in such a short time as a platform to discuss economics and public policy. I was appointed as a Consul of Mexico in September 2008. The Consulate of Mexico in St. Paul is one of the 50 consulates that Mexico has in the U.S. I'm responsible for the relationship with both Dakotas and northern Wisconsin. I cover the largest geographical area of all the consulates of Mexico in the U.S. Yeah, and just to tell you that the consular network of Mexico is really an asset of our foreign policy. Even though we have a small staff, small budget, we function like a small embassy. Besides issuing documents, official documents of Mexico to our nationals, we have 200,000 Mexicans living in Minnesota. We issue all these documents, make passports and all our official documents. Besides that, we take care of the needs of the Mexican community here in Minnesota and in the Dakotas. And as well, we work together with the authorities to send the right message to our community, to know the rules, to know the laws, to abide by those rules and laws. And also we make sure that their rights are being observed. Besides that, we promote health and education. We provide the tools to our community for a better integration into this society. As well, we showcase Mexico, the richness, the cultural richness of Mexico, and we promote trade and investment. And that is why I'm very happy to have Ambassador Sarukhan here. For a consul, is the best thing that can happen, to have an ambassador here, my good friend and my boss, Arturo Sarukhan. So, a warm welcome to him. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Muffy McMillan, and I'm on the board of the Economic Club of Minnesota. I'm honored to introduce our special guest, Arturo Sarukhan. He's Ambassador of Mexico, as you all know, to the United States. The grandson of refugees in Mexico, Ambassador Sarukhan is a career diplomat. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs. He was posted in 1993 to the Mexican Embassy in the United States, where he first served as Chief of Staff to the Ambassador, and then as head of the Counter-Narcotics Office. In 2000, he became Chief of Policy Planning at the Foreign Ministry. He was appointed by the President as Mexican Consul General to New York City in 2003. In 2006, he served on the presidential campaign of Felipe Calderon as Foreign Policy Advisor and International Spokesperson. He became Coordinator for Foreign Affairs in the transition team. In November 2006, he received the rank of Ambassador. In February 2007, he was appointed Mexican Ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Sarukhan is active in various organizations, such as the Mexican Council on Foreign Affairs, the Foreign Policy Association, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. I love this part right here. He's a board member of the Philharmonic Orchestra of the Americas. He's also a part of the Executive Council on Diplomacy Ambassadors Advisory Board. Ambassador Sarukhan holds a BA in International Relations from El Colegio de Mexico and an MA in U.S. Foreign Policy from the School of Advanced International Studies. where he was a Fulbright Scholar and Ford Foundation Fellow. He has been decorated by governments of both Spain and Sweden. Ambassador Sarukhan is married and has 2 daughters. Please help me welcome our distinguished guest.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Muffy, for that introduction, and thanks to the Economic Club, Congressman Kennedy, Muffy, for all your hospitality in the Twin Cities. Ana Luisa, I don't want to remind you that when President Calderon came on his state visit to Washington, D.C. last year, the commandant of Andrews Air Force Base and I were on the tarmac waiting for the plane to land, and the commandant looks at me and says, "Oh, Ambassador, you must be thrilled that the President is coming into town." And I said, "I'll be happier when it's wheels up." So I know that the consulate feels exactly the same way about me leaving Minnesota this evening. Whenever I give a speech, and certainly today, and look at a group as important and as representative of Minnesota's strengths as the one that we have today, I'm reminded of what happened at the turn of the century, the previous century, what happened to a senator from the state of New York called Chauncey Pugh. And Senator Chauncey Pugh was tasked with presenting President William Howard Taft at a union event in New York City. And this senator had the reputation of being a glib and long-winded speaker. And so he goes up to the lectern and starts speaking and speaking and speaking, goes on forever. And he finally sums up his speech. Everyone's almost asleep. And he sums up his speech by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, I now have the privilege of presenting to you President William Howard Taft, a man pregnant with integrity and pregnant with courage." And so President Taft comes up to the lectern, looks at the senator, smiles, and says, "Well, if it's a girl, I'll call her integrity. If it's a boy, I'll call him chastity. But if it's just a gas, I'll call him Chauncey Pugh." So I will try and be as brief as I can, because I don't want anyone leaving this room saying something similar to what happened in New York more than a century ago. Let me start my remarks today by giving you a sense of where the U.S.-Mexico relationship is today, and I'll weave into this discussion issues that I hope and I'm sure will be important to this Economic Club, issues which I think all of you either follow closely, some of you are engaged profoundly in, because you have very important footprints as I look around this room and see many companies that have a very important footprint in Mexico. And if I may, I'm going to use sort of a crutch, which is last year was the 20th anniversary of the publication of what is probably the most important book that has ever been written on the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. It was written by a New York Times correspondent who spent 6 years in Mexico. His name was Alan Riding. I'm sure several of you remember reading his pieces from when he was correspondent in Mexico. And he wrote a book called Distant Neighbors. And given that last year was the 20th anniversary of the publication of the book, let me use this sort of as an artificial crutch to discuss with you today whether 20 years after this book was published, are Mexico and the United States still distant neighbors, or have we become something else? And obviously the kosher answer to that, which I will address, is that we're a bit of both. There are certainly issues where we have become true strategic partners, and there is a true strategic relationship between Mexico and the United States. There are issues where we are moving in that direction, and there are issues in which, unfortunately, we are still several years away from being able to resolve and address in a way that will constructively address the strategic needs not only of Mexico, of the United States, but of North America writ large. And let me start with the one issue that explains why this relationship today has become strategic, and it's trade. And I know that in these times, especially when so many families in America and in most places around the world are hurting because of the global recession, it is extremely popular to use trade as a scapegoat. And the problem is that facts and figures don't fit in nice bumper stickers on the back of your car. It's much easier to post no to free trade or no to NAFTA on a bumper sticker about this size than to give you the data that I'm about to give you. But it is a very profound example of how this relationship has been transformed since 1993 when we negotiated and approved NAFTA. Trade has been the great equalizer in the US-Mexico relationship. Mexico today, and I would have said something different 3 months ago, but this quarter we have once again surpassed China as your second largest trading partner. Mexico is the United States' second largest trading partner after Canada. China and Mexico have been jostling back and forth for the past 3 years, but today, this quarter, Mexico is again your second largest trading partner. On any given day, $1 billion, with a B, $1 billion of trade go across our border in both directions. $1 billion a day of bilateral trade between Mexico and the United States. We have become the first or second export market for 28 states in America today. And there are 10 million US jobs directly related to trade with Mexico in these 28 states. Mexico and Canada buy $9 for every dollar that China buys from the United States. And Mexico, this data, I hope, will cause the reaction that it generally causes, I think is a very telling example of how much Mexico and Mexico's economy have grown and expanded. If you want to think of Europe, Mexico buys more US exports than the UK, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands combined. If you're focused in Latin America, Mexico buys more US exports than all of Latin America and the Caribbean put together. And if you're focused on the new sexy Asia Pacific, Mexico is buying more US exports today than China and Japan combined. This is a very compelling history of how through trade, this relationship and the nature of this relationship have changed. And the underlying reality that also explains this is something that very few people read or understand when they turn on their TV or listen to radio or read the papers, which is that Mexico has become a middle-income country. And it is the result of a four-pronged process, and I'll go very quickly down the list. A, sustained, responsible macroeconomic policies that we put in place since the last global financial crises that we were responsible for. You were responsible for 2009, we were responsible for 1994, but since then, Mexico has put in place sustained, responsible macroeconomic policies and very stringent banking regulations that prevented the banking sector in Mexico to go into subprimes and toxic assets. And that's one of the reasons that explains why, right after 2009, the Mexican banking sector was already starting to lend relatively quickly. And it's one of the reasons that it also explains why, after the recession in 2009, last year we grew at 5% with 3% inflation, 4% unemployment, and why this year we are slated to grow at around 4.9. This is a very compelling story, and it's having a profound impact on Mexico's economic outlook. The second reason is because we have negotiated what, along with Chile, is the most ambitious free trade agreement network on the face of the earth. We are the only country in the world that, besides having a free trade agreement with the United States, has a free trade agreement with the European Union, with Chile, with Israel, with Singapore, with Japan. And we are now, hopefully as a result of our joint decision, Canada and Mexico, at the recent APEC summit, of having announced that we will start consultations to engage in TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is probably the most important tool to enhance North American competitiveness via access to the Asia-Pacific market. The third driver is demographic change in Mexico. And if your birth rate was 2.4 last year, you're going to be probably surprised to hear that Mexico's birth rate was 2.2. And in 20, 25 years, our demographics are going to look a lot like yours. We're becoming an older society. So even if Lou Dobbs goes down on his knees to the shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico to ask for excess labor to come up to Napa Valley or to do roofing in Long Island, it won't be there simply because of how demographics will have kicked in and have changed the socioeconomic profile in Mexico. And finally, the fourth driver of this seismic change that has happened in Mexico is what is probably the most important extreme poverty alleviation program on the face of the earth. As you probably know very well, Latin America is not the poorest region in the world, but it is the most unequal. And extreme poverty has always been an endemic challenge throughout the region. What Mexico did 15 plus years ago was put in place a program which was originally called Solidaridad, Solidarity, and now is called Oportunidades, Opportunities, which what it does, it provides microcredit, conditional cash transfers to the female head of household. It doesn't give it to the man. It gives it to the female head of household, contingent on two things happening at home. One, she and the kids are getting their vaccines and medical examinations on time, and B, the kids are enrolled in school with passing grades. If either of these two conditionalities are not met, the microcredits are withheld. And this program single-handedly in the past 15 years has brought 40 million people out of extreme poverty in Mexico. So it is these four factors, combined with how trade has played into the equation, that are completely turning around the template of our relationship based on economic growth and trade facilitation. So trade has been a fundamental driver in this fundamental shift that has occurred in our bilateral relationship. What issue is sort of, you know, where like the hapless horseman with one boot in the stirrup and one on the ground, where we're sort of moving away from a relationship of a distant neighborhood and becoming strategic partners in the fight against organized crime. After 9/11, and people in Mexico may or may not enjoy hearing this, but in the aftermath of 9/11, what became absolutely clear was that a perception of threat to the security of the United States, or a real threat to the security of the United States materializing across the border from Mexico, would scuttle this edifice that we had been building as a result of NAFTA. So again, despite the pundits out there, it behooves Mexico to work hand in hand with the United States to ensure that our border is secure against the threat of either potential terrorist organizations or very violent transnational organized crime. And we've come a long way, not only in terms of what we're doing together to enhance security. I think the plot that we unraveled with the United States a month or so ago, in which there was an attempt being plotted on the life of my Saudi colleague in Washington, D.C., where Mexico and the United States worked together to defang this plot, or what we just announced 2 days ago, which was an attempt by one of the sons of Gaddafi to come to Mexico and sort of try and hide out and live in Mexico, which we also foiled. I think these are very compelling stories of how Mexico and the United States have been working together to enhance our security. And we've also moved a long way from the time when the United States would point its finger at Mexico and say, you're the springboard of all the drugs coming into the United States, and Mexico, obviously, in a nationalistic, chest-thumping way, would retort, if we're the swimming pool, if we're the springboard, you're the swimming pool. Both countries have understood that the only way that we will take on the challenge of transnational organized crime is through a paradigm of joint responsibility. That is, that Mexico will continue to work to prevent drugs moving north, either from other parts in Latin America into the US market, or marijuana, basically small portions of heroin, in Mexico going into the US market, but that we need the help of the United States to shut down the flow of bulk cash, $8 billion of bulk cash crossing the border from the United States every year into Mexico, and guns going into Mexico. And I know that the gun issue and Second Amendment rights are a very divisive and very complex issue in the American landscape, in the American political landscape of today. And let me be very clear about this, because there's been sort of an urban myth that has been festering out there. The Mexican government is not seeking to undermine the Second Amendment. That is a sovereign decision of the American Congress and of the American people, regardless of whether I personally think that you shouldn't be able to buy armor-piercing ammo to hunt deer. But what I am convinced of is that the Founding Fathers did not draft the Second Amendment to A, allow international organized crime to illicitly buy weapons in the US, B, to illicitly cross them over an international border, and C, to allow individuals who shouldn't be buying guns in the first place to buy those guns. So what we have asked of Congress and of the administration is help us enforce what's already in the books. Help us shut down the flow of those guns illegally being bought in the United States by transnational organized crime and brought across the border into Mexico. And certainly not everything is perfect. There are still significant challenges, but the way the paradigm has changed is a fundamental shift in our relationship. If what we announced 4 or 5 months ago, which is Mexico and the United States using drones, UAVs, to do signals intelligence over Mexican airspace, in intercepting phone calls, in pinpointing the location of drug kingpins, in finding out safe houses, in monitoring trafficking routes so our teams on the ground can intercept. If you had asked me, will Mexico and the United States ever reach a point where they're doing what I have just described? If you had asked me this question 6, 7 years ago, I probably would have said you're smoking too much of what we're seizing in Mexico. This is how much the paradigm of security cooperation has changed between Mexico and the United States, and we have to continue to build upon this very successful story that we're developing. What is the third issue where we are still, unfortunately, distant neighbors? And it's obviously the 800-pound gorilla in the room, immigration. And as most things in this relationship, you need two to tango. This is an issue that the United States will not be able to solve on its own, and Mexico will not be able to solve on its own, or any other immigrant, any other country that has a significant immigration flow of people illegally crossing into the United States. What needs to happen? What does a solution to this need to look like? I said you need two to tango. On the Mexican side of the border, you need Mexico to continue to grow at the rates of growth that I have just shared with you, so that we can continue to anchor these talented, entrepreneurial, bold women and men at home in Mexico. Put it very simply, our loss is your gain. If we can't hold on to these talented women and men, Mexico will not be able to grow at the rate of growth that we need to bridge those economic asymmetries. We need to anchor every single one of these women and men at home with a good job in Mexico. And the second thing that Mexico needs to do is ensure that every single Mexican is crossing over the border, A, through a designated port of entry, and with a visa. On the other side of the border, we need a comprehensive immigration reform that makes sense. And the only way there's going to be a doable, feasible immigration reform that is sellable to the different political actors that play a role in this is by binding two fundamental components and locking them in a single undertaking negotiation, which means you don't have agreement in box A until you have an agreement in box B. And these two components are A, I'm sure you will understand, it's about speaking of stocks and flows. We need to address the stock, that is the 11 million undocumented immigrants who are in the United States today without papers. And addressing this issue isn't just about whether it's the right thing to do or it's the moral thing to do. We need to bring these people out of the shadows because it makes sense from a security point of view. It is much better to know who 11 million people are, where they come from, which countries, from which countries they came, where they live, what their names are. Second, it helps us to combat the depression of wages that occurs because there are people with no papers who can be exploited in the labor market, and then that brings down wages. So you need to do something with these 11 million people. You need to bring them out of the shadows. Call it whatever you want. A path to citizenship, a earned regularization. I would not call it a path to citizenship. I would call it a path to documented status. And what does this entail? A, they pay a fine. They go to the back of the queue of those people who have been seeking to enter this country legally with a visa and are waiting in line. They go to the back of that line. They prove that they have no criminal record. They have a visa sponsor, that is a employee who vouches that they have a job with them, and that they can prove a decent, sufficient command of English. This isn't amnesty. And this is a way of ensuring that this labor will continue to add to the economic vitality of the United States. The other component, box B, is a temporary worker program, the flow. This is stock, this is flow. How do you ensure that the American economy will have the labor that it needs, especially in certain sectors, to be able to grow? And what has happened over the past decade, despite the pundits, is not that more and more Mexicans or people from other countries are crossing illegally into the United States. In the case of Mexico, we have seen a plateau over the past 10 years of around 350,000 people who attempt to cross the border illegally every year. So it hasn't gone up. It's been flat, and in fact, I'll get there in a second, it is dramatically falling. What has changed is that the individual who's now crossing the border does not do what he did in the past, which was in the past, before 9/11, he would cross maybe on his first attempt. He wouldn't have to pay anything to anyone to get across. He'd go to Washington State, participate in the apple harvest, then he'd move to Long Island, do some roofing, and then over the holidays he'd go back to Mexico, and then the next year he'd come back. There was a circular mobility of labor, of people going back and forth, illegally, but going back and forth. As a result of heightened border enforcement and the presence of transnational organized crime that is muscling its way into human trafficking because we have impacted their ability to bring drugs across the border, and they do what any business does, which is hostile takeovers and mergers and acquisitions. Now that immigrant is not crossing on his first attempt, he's crossing on his 8th or 9th attempt, and he's paying anywhere between $5,000 to $6,000 to a human trafficking ring to get him across the border. So once he's on this side of the border, the incentives of going back and forth as he used to in the past have completely evaporated. So the challenge is not more people coming over, but more people who are here, staying put and not going back. And this is why a temporary worker program is such an important piece of the equation, because it brings back a legal, orderly, transparent way of employees and willing employers of getting together. And these are the two critical components. What I hope we can do, we and you can do in the near future, I don't think it's feasible as long as we have an election in the United States next year and as long as the economy looks like it looks today. But I hope that these trends that we're seeing will allow us to push the one reset button that we do need to push in the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, which is our respective domestic conversations about immigration and what it entails and what each side has to do, and the bilateral conversation of how do we solve what is undoubtedly the single most important issue for the economic competitiveness and well-being of the United States and of Mexico. Because what is now happening on the border is that this year, by the time this year closes, we will have seen zero net migration from Mexico into the United States. And we have seen in the past 4 years a 60% decrease in undocumented immigrants trying to cross illegally into the United States. Why? It's not rocket science. A, because of what I've already told you about what's happening in the Mexican economy and Mexican demographics. People are finding jobs and better paid jobs and are staying home. B, because of the dynamics of enforcement and the presence of criminal organizations on the border that has made it so much more difficult to cross. And B, because this economy, particularly in the construction sector, which has always been a magnet for undocumented labor, has shrunk, and therefore there are fewer jobs to be had. But the combination of these three things are having a profound impact on those flows across the board. And what I do hope is that by putting the issue of flows off the table, we can address stock and then come back to the flows understood as a new temporary worker program that will provide mobility in our North American market. Based on these three dynamics, a truly strategic relationship, a relationship that is moving in that direction, and one issue which still pulls us and bogs us down, we have been working with the Obama administration on 5 strategic drivers to propel this relationship forward. 1, no surprises, border security. For the same reasons that I enunciated a few minutes ago, we have to make sure that our border is secure. We will continue to work hand in hand to ensure that we cover your back, that you help us in preventing the flow of guns and cash coming into Mexico, and that we can provide a greater sense of common domain awareness for North America, which is a critical component of our footprint in the global community. The challenge also is that it not only entails these traditional threats to security, but as we saw with H1N1, it also means that both countries have to think and rethink how we engage with non-traditional security threats like global pandemics, like the one that hit us in 2009, and in which Mexico and the United States played a unique role of working together, containing the virus, communicating to public opinion what was going on. And there's a company in this room that played a pivotal role in very quickly providing and accelerating their production of everything from hand sanitizers to gels and foam, so that we could very quickly, as we mobilize society, contain the virus. So security isn't just about the traditional things we think of when we think of security. It also entails newer stuff that is happening out there that we have to focus on. The second strategic driver that we are pursuing is, as we strengthen the security on the border, because of that $1 billion per day of trade that we have to make sure that we have the border infrastructure that allows us to facilitate trade across our borders. We are pulling up our border infrastructure by the bootstraps through non-intrusive technology, through fast and sentry lanes, so that produce and individuals can move back and forth. We have successfully negotiated a global entry program, which now allows Mexican nationals and Americans going down to Mexico to use these booths in our airports to facilitate transit through migration. We inaugurated 3 new ports of entry on our border last year alone, the first 3 new ports of entry that have been built in more than a decade. And as most of our land, 73% of our trade goes by land. And as increasingly land cargo moves away from trucks to rail, how do we enhance our connectivity in rail across the border? So modernizing this border infrastructure is going to be a critical component, and we will continue to work in that direction. The third strategic driver is energy efficiency, energy security. Most people in this room, I assume, know that on any given day, it's not the Venezuelas or the Saudi Arabias or the Russias that provide the highest number of barrels of oil to the United States. It is either Canada or it's Mexico. And so how do we develop a North American energy security template that A, helps wean the United States from less reliable sources of oil in the hemisphere or elsewhere, B, that prevents other Deepwater Horizon spills. We don't want that happening in the Gulf again. But also, how do we think of renewables, and how do Mexico, the United States, and Canada, which have huge natural and technological assets to bring to bear on renewables and green jobs, work together in this direction? This is one of the reasons why also Mexico and the United States have just, this isn't public, it's not a secret, we will be announcing it hopefully very soon in the coming weeks, but this is one of the reasons why Mexico and the United States have just finished successfully negotiating a treaty, an agreement for the exploitation of joint transboundary reservoirs in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a huge, huge piece of the equation. This, again, 5-6 years ago, would have never happened. I would have never been able to convince you guys to sit down at the negotiating table, and I would have never gotten the green light from my Senate to start negotiations on the sacrosanct issue of energy in Mexico with the United States. This is a huge piece of the component of how the relationship is moving forward in the energy sector. The fourth strategic driver is, how do we continue to create economic growth and prosperity on both sides of the border? It entails everything from getting immigration reform right, which I've just spoken at length with, but it also means labor mobility written large. That is, companies like yours hiring the best talent in Canada, the United States, or Mexico, regardless. And it also means understanding the role that human capital plays in North America to compete with the likes of China and India. But at the same time, it also means rethinking our paradigms of social well-being. How do we in Mexico provide for health care of Mexicans in the United States, regardless of whether they're documented or not? Mexico, at some point, I still don't know exactly when it will happen, when we'll sort of be ringing the bell, but at some point between late spring and early summer of next year, Mexico will be formally announcing that we have reached the milestone of providing universal health coverage to every single Mexican citizen. And we will be seeking to expand that so that we can include Mexicans on this side of the border. But at the same time, when you stop and think of how this equation looks on the other side of the border, we have the largest American expat community living abroad in Mexico. 1.5 million Americans live in Mexico today. What would happen? Imagine the efficiencies and the impact that this would have on the treasuries and on the fiscal situation of both countries if those 1.5 million Americans have portability of their Social Security, and by certifying hospitals and clinics and doctors in Mexico, they don't have to come here back to the U.S. on an annual pilgrimage to get their checkup or to go to hospital. They can do it in Mexico. Imagine the pools of well-being that could generate on both sides of the border. So these are some of the things that we've started to think of as we think of economic prosperity and well-being in Mexico and the United States. And finally, global and regional issues. Mexico and the United States are working now hand in hand to work jointly on issues that we have common perceptions, common challenges in the global and regional arena. For a very simple reason. Mexico is not a military superpower. We are a cultural superpower, but we're not a military superpower. And for a country like mine, there's only one way to go around the world. You sit at the table or you're on the menu. And I want Mexico to be sitting at the table, and the best way to do that is to enhance the strategic dialogue with the United States on issues like Iran and North Korea, and what we've been doing in Egypt in training electoral authorities together. We have a very solid, very strong, very well-reputed electoral institution in Mexico. We are providing training and electoral assistance to Egypt so the Arab Spring can become an Arab summer. We worked hand in hand when Mexico was sitting at the helm of the UN Security Council in 2010 to send an equivocal message to Iran in terms of its need to comply with the Pacific uses of nuclear power. We've been working hand in hand to confront some of the challenges that we see in the hemisphere with some countries that should not be doing certain stuff in this neck of the woods. This discussion that was never a formal part of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship today is a central component of our formal bilateral agenda. We will have a unique challenge next year. As you know, our two electoral cycles will coincide in 2012. And as in all good families, there will be looniness and stupidity and flatulence on both sides of the border. The challenge will be also that the typically worst moment of a presidential campaign in the United States is the primary. And the primaries will coincide with the full-fledged presidential campaign in Mexico. Our primary will end in February. We will have presidential campaign from February to July, and you will be in primary mode until the conventions in the summer. So the number one challenge that we will face is that we will have to Teflon coat the bilateral relationship so that some of the stupidity that does get said on the campaign trail on either side of the border does not stick and does not contaminate the bilateral relationship that we've been developing. And B, that we lock in this fundamental sea change that has occurred in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, that we institutionalize a lot of the stuff that I have just described for you, so that when we have, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that you will have a new administration in Mexico. I was about to say when we have two new administrations. So when you have a new administration in Mexico, and whether you have a new administration here or a second term for the current administration, what we want to prevent is people seeking to reinvent the wheel. What we need to do is to build upon what we have achieved and to extend and deepen the strategic engagement that we have developed with the United States over these past 5 years. I do believe I am a Mexican citizen and a citizen of North America that does believe that Mexico and the United States are joined at the hip for the good. and that a rising tide can, should, and will lift boats on both sides of the border. The challenge that we have in the coming months and years is whether Mexico and the United States continue to play chess or start playing chess or continue to play checkers. It's a very, very simple solution. We need to think strategically ahead. And I think there's been a fundamental change in attitudes. Octavio Paz, who was one of Mexico's Nobel laureates, wrote many years ago an essay about America and Mexico. And he wrote that the United States and Mexico had a very tough time getting along because Americans didn't know how to listen and Mexicans didn't know how to speak up. Well, one of the things that has changed, ladies and gentlemen, is that the United States is finally tuning in and Americans and Mexicans are speaking up. And this, I think, is one of the most profound cultural, societal differences and changes that has occurred as a result of NAFTA and our daily interaction across the border, whether it's corporations, businesses, think tanks, Kiwani and Rotary clubs, Boy Scouts, soccer clubs, or baseball teams. This connectivity that is occurring on both sides of the border is changing the landscape of how our two countries interact with one another. And at the end of the day, what I think we need to make sure is that our two societies remain co-stakeholders to each other's success. I know that there are pressing geostrategic challenges for the United States today, whether it's the global economy or whether it's Iran or Afghanistan or the Middle East or Iraq or Northern Africa. But if you stop for a second and think, there are no two countries on the face of the earth that are more important to each other's security, prosperity, and well-being on a daily basis than Mexico and the United States. And the message that we have to send to people on both sides of the border is, in this game, we will succeed or we will fail together. Thank you very much.
Wonderful remarks, very important relationship indeed, and I think we all feel more informed about it. Let's just take two questions because we're running a little bit behind here, and then get everybody out. Who's got the first question? Do I see it in the back here? Maybe repeat the question.
The question was whether I would consider running for the presidency in Mexico. Actually, she said next year. That's not going to happen anytime soon, certainly. But given that this is a very public room, I'm always reminded of the fact that diplomats or politicians and flies have one thing in common: we can both get killed by a newspaper. So I will tread very carefully around this one and simply say that I have one big handicap, which is that I suffer fools, and it shows a mile away, and that's lousy for elected politics.
I don't know anything about having trouble with newspapers. It's one last question. Do we have a last question? Do I see a hand up? If not, he obviously covered the topic very thoroughly. Thanks for your attention. Have a wonderful holidays at Christmas. We'll look forward to having you back here next year. Thank you again.
The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.